Okay, section 8.3 is where you're going to be using sine, cosine, and tangent. So you may have heard those words before, but what they do is they set up ratios of sides of a right triangle so that you can find a missing side length or you can find a missing angle. You may or may not have heard of SOHCAHTOA. So SOHCAHTOA is a abbreviation / acronym to help you remember which one is which. So for example, if I'm going to do the sine of an angle, if I do the sine of angle A, that would be this angle here. The sine of an angle always goes the opposite side length over the hypotenuse. So I would have to go to the opposite side, put that measure on top, and put the length of the hypotenuse on the bottom. So SOHCAHTOA, the SO, S-O-H, stands for sine for the S, O represents the opposite, and H represents the hypotenuse. This kind of helps you remember which one goes with which. So for example, the cosine of A is the adjacent leg over the hypotenuse. So I abbreviate these and go opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent. So if I'm at angle A, the adjacent side is the side that's touching that angle. So that would be this side. The hypotenuse would be the side opposite the right angle. Then for tangent, I would do the opposite side, which would be over here, over the adjacent side. So again, this will help you remember what each one applies to if you can remember the wording, SOHCAHTOA. So SOHCAHTOA, again, is an acronym for how you set up your ratios. So if you would like, I would encourage you to pause the video and copy that down just so you have reference so that when you do a quiz or test, you know what the sine, cosine, tangent are. Okay, how do we set up sine, cosine, tangent? So this is saying what are the sine, cosine, tangent ratios for the angle T. So here is my angle T. If I'm going to do sine, sine is opposite over the hypotenuse. So if you label these, this side is the opposite, this side would be adjacent, and then this side is always my hypotenuse. So my ratio says do the opposite over the hypotenuse. So I would say the sine of t is equal to 8 over 17. For cosine, it says adjacent over hypotenuse. So I would do 15 over 17. And then for the tangent of t, I would do opposite over adjacent. So you're really just setting up ratios depending on which one that they're giving you. Pause the video and try the got it question. So in the got it question, I'm again trying to find sine, cosine, tangent, but now I'm using the letter G. So now I'm doing this angle. So the only thing that it would change would be my two legs. This side would now be the opposite, and this side would now be the adjacent. So for the sine of G, I would do 15 over 17. For the cosine of G, I would do 8 over 17. And for the tangent of G, I would do 15 over 8. Alright, so that's just getting you comfortable with what sine, cosine, tangent are. Now is where we're actually going to use math to help us figure out a side length. So here is my first problem. So on letter A, they give me a triangle, and they want me to find the letter W. So the angle that they give me, I want to see how that is comparing to the two sides. So here's the angle that they gave me. I need to see, is this side the opposite or the adjacent to it, and what is this side? So notice that 54 is opposite the side labeled W, so that means this is the opposite side. This side is opposite my right angle, so I know that this is my hypotenuse. So since I'm given an opposite side and a hypotenuse, that tells me I'm going to be using sine as one of my trig functions. So I would set up my equation as the sine of my angle, which is 54, equaling the opposite, which is W, over the hypotenuse, which is 17. I have to solve for W. So remember that this fraction bar means divide, so I'm going to times both sides by 17. So when I do that, my 17s cancel, so I'm just left with W. This side I need to type into my calculator. So on your calculator, you're going to type in 17 times, find your sine button, so here's sine of 54. So my answer was 13.75 blah blah blah. They want me to round to the nearest tenth, so I would look at this second number and I would get round this 7 up, so I would write 13.8 since that number behind it was 5 or bigger. Okay, let's try one more here. So here's my second problem. Here's the angle that they're giving me. I need to see how do the sides compare to my angle. So 28 is opposite this side that they give me. So that tells me that this is an opposite side. 28 is touching this side, so I know that this side is my adjacent. Now you may be asking the question, well, it's also touching the other side. You're right. But remember that the side opposite the right angle is always reserved as the hypotenuse. So that's how I can distinguish between the two. Okay, so the trig function that uses opposite and adjacent is tangent. So here's how I would set up my equation. I would do the tangent of 28, which is my angle, set it equal to my opposite side 1.0 over W. Now this one's a little bit different because my thing that I'm solving for is in the denominator of this fraction. So we're going to times both sides by W first so that this W gets out of that denominator. So that means that W is going to go to that other side. Then I have this equation. So now that that W is out of the denominator, it went over. Now I need to come back and divide by this tangent of 28 so that the W gets by itself. So when I divide by the tangent of 28, I can get W by itself. So we need to plug this into our calculator. So we would do 1 divided by, find the tangent button, and do the tangent of 28. Notice I get 1.88. I need to round to the nearest tenth. So since the second number is at 8, I got to round that up. So I end up getting 1.9. Alright, pause the video and you try the last one. Okay, on the last one, I look to see how my angle compares to my side. So I get an adjacent side and I get a hypotenuse side. So since I'm using adjacent and hypotenuse, that tells me I use cosine as my trig function. So I set up my equation. I get the cosine of my angle, which is 33, equaling the adjacent W over the hypotenuse 4.5. I need to solve for W, so I have to divide or times both sides by 4.5. So on my calculator, I do 4.5 times the cosine of 33, and I get this. I need to round up since the second number is 5 and higher, so you should be getting 3.8. Alright, the next piece is where we're going to do not side lengths, but instead you can find the angle measurements. So this first one, they want me to find x to the nearest degree. So I'm trying to find what is the measure of this angle. So again, I compare the sides to my angle and see what they're giving me. When I go across here, that means that 6 is my opposite side and that 10 is the hypotenuse. So since they gave me opposite and hypotenuse, that means I want to use the sine function. So I would set up my equation like this, where I have the sine of x equaling my opposite over my hypotenuse. Now, we want to get x by itself, so we have to undo this sign. So, there is an inverse of sine that can be written as that. So we're going to do the inverse of sine to both sides. So what that means is this is what I end up getting. So when I do the inverse of sine, that cancels it out. I need to do the inverse of sine of 6/10. So on your calculator, you're going to see that above your sine button, you should have that same notation where it says sine to the -1. You're going to do second sine in order for that to come up. And then you're going to type in your ratio, so 6/10. So I get 36.86. It wants me to round to the nearest degree, so that means I end up rounding to 37 because this number behind my whole number is 5 and higher. Let's try another one. So here's my triangle. I compare what they're giving me. So I have angle X up top. My sides are an adjacent side and a hypotenuse of that X. So adjacent and hypotenuse means I need to use cosine. So I set up my equation. Cosine of X equals 15/20. I need to do the inverse of cosine in order for that cosine to go away. So that means it becomes the measure of X equaling the inverse of cosine of 15/20. So on your calculator, you're going to want to find that inverse of cosine, which should be right above cosine. So you would need to hit second cosine in order for you to see it, and then type in your ratio. So our ratio was 15/20. Rounding to the nearest degree would be 41 on this one since the number behind there is less than 5. So my answer would be 41. Alright, see if you can do the got it question. So pause the video. Alright, in the got it question, here's my triangle wanting me to find the measure of angle Y. So when I compare my sides, I have an opposite side and an adjacent side. So the trig function that applies that is tangent. So I would want to set up my equation. The tangent of Y equals 100/41. I would want to get rid of that tangent so I can find what Y is. So I do the inverse of tangent on both sides. So I get the inverse of tangent of 100/41. So I would type in second tangent to get that inverse button. Then I would type in 100 divided by 41, and I get 67.7, so that should round to 68 as a whole number. Okay, that's it for sine, cosine, and tangent. So if you still have questions or you need more examples, please let me know.